little girl named Irene, playing hide and seek in the woods with her father. Afterward, Dad guides her on how to pick up a mushroom, which she grabs and places in her basket. Irene then stays behind to relieve herself, while her dad heads toward the main road. But then, when Irene tries to find her dad, the little girl arrives at the main road, and notices a car whose driver hauntingly stares at her before speeding away. Scared, Irene notices mushrooms scattered across the ground, and then, looking in the distance, she spots her father's lifeless body, and the sight hits the poor girl like a ton of bricks. The scene then cuts to 10 years later, where we see a teenage Irene preparing for a swimming competition. Her coach offers some motivation and warns her to save breath for the final 30 meters. The race soon begins, and Irene pushes herself to the limit. However, despite her best efforts, another girl ends up winning. Irene finishes second, and her competitor tries to console her, saying it's only a matter of a few seconds, but this only enrages Irene, who punches her, leaving the poor girl bloodied. Later, the coach approaches Irene in the locker room and demands that she apologize to the girl or face disqualification. But Irene refuses and grows aggressive toward him as well. The coach gets frustrated with her behavior and calls her a useless loser. Afterward, her mom advises her to take a break from training to avoid seeing that girl again. She also urges Irene to see a doctor for her issues, but the rebellious teen clearly isn't interested. Days later, Irene is relaxing in her room when her little sister Pam arrives, and asks why Irene hasn't been going to school or joining competitions lately. But Irene snaps at the kid and harshly kicks her out of the room, so her stepdad comes in, questioning why she's being so mean to her sister, but Irene rudely replies that they're only half-sisters. Mom quickly diffuses the situation, and tells Irene that if she's not going to study, she should find a job. But the angry brat lashes out, and accuses her mom of starting a new life and forgetting about her dad. The mother ends up slapping Irene, which really hurts her feelings. In the next scene, Irene arrives at her aunt's house, and begins showing her the many machines and how they work. She advises the teenager not to worry, promising to place her in a less complicated department at first. Just then, the factory owner, Michael, arrives, and Milana introduces him to Irene, revealing she's a new worker. Michael asks about her life, and learns she is 18, and dropped out of school. However, the moment he hears her full name, Irene Trevelyan, Michael is shocked. He walks away without saying anything. We see Michael growing increasingly anxious, as he recalls an incident from many years ago, when he was young and used to get high with his friends. One day, they bet him a bottle of rum, and dared him to jump from a high building. A whole crowd gathered to witness, and Michael ended up landing safely, and winning the bet. Just then, Michael noticed a young woman named Laura, someone he had a fling with in the past, but couldn't quite remember her name. He used his charm to convince her to come with him. The two then went to his car and ended up getting intimate, during which Laura asked if he would remember her next time, and if he would invite her to his place. But Michael made it clear he wasn't interested in that kind of commitment, so a furious Laura decided to walk home. However, Michael felt guilty for his behavior and asked her to get back in. Laura reluctantly agreed, but insisted she would do the driving since he was drunk. In the present, Michael is approached by Laura, who is now his wife. She wonders why he's so anxious, so Michael responds that their German client has invited them to dinner to close a major deal. He suggests she come along since she's an excellent lawyer, to which Laura happily agrees. That night, we see Michael still anxious and struggling to sleep with his thoughts racing. The next day, he suddenly informs Milana that he's decided to fire Irene, as they don't need any new employees. Milana asks if the girl did something wrong or if he knows her, but Michael quickly denies it. She then insists that he at least let Irene finish her trial period, promising that if the girl messes up, she'll fire her herself, and he has no choice but to agree. Meanwhile, Irene is approached by a coworker named Loris, who seems interested in her. He asks for her social media, but Irene responds that she doesn't have one. Loris then tells her that if she ever wants to hang out, she can find him at a pub called Piazza Dante. Their interaction is observed by another female coworker, Agata, who seems visibly jealous. In the evening, we see Michael and Laura attending dinner with a German client. But Michael seems distant for some reason, and even shows a hint of attitude. This worries Laura, who does her best to stay polite, and keep the dinner lively so they don't lose the deal. The client even flirts with her subtly, but Michael either fails to notice, or simply chooses not to care. When they return home, Laura confronts her husband for being rude to their important client, but he doesn't care, and calls the man an idiot for living off his family's money. The next day, Michael reads a news article about Irene's swimming competition, and learns about her outburst. Elsewhere, we see Irene arriving at a local pool to swim, since it's the only thing that frees her from the weight of her negative thoughts. Soon, several girls arrive for training, and the coach tells Irene she can't be there, or she needs to switch lanes. Irene obeys without hesitation, and the coach quickly notices that she's exceptionally skilled. While leaving the pool later, Irene is shocked to spot Michael sitting in his car with a driver. She nervously waves at him, but he doesn't respond and simply orders his driver to leave. In the next scene, we see Irene and Loris making out at the club and growing close. Over the following days, she sticks to her daily routine at the factory, exchanging mischievous glances with Loris, and even swimming from time to time. One day, when Irene arrives at work, she finds her bicycle tire mysteriously flat. She realizes it was a jealous Agata who did it, but chooses not to react and quietly continues with her work. Later, while Irene is working, she receives a text from Loris inviting her to hook up. She thus pretends to be sick, and heads to find her supervisor to request leave. But Irene unexpectedly runs into Michael, who asks what's wrong. She claims that she's sick and needs time off, but Michael spots Loris's truck parked outside and realizes she's lying. He refuses to grant her leave at first, but when Irene gets angry, he finally relents and lets her go. While Irene is leaving the office, she is spotted by Laura, who is surprised to see an unfamiliar face. She asks Michael about her, and he responds that Irene is just a new worker and she wanted to leave early. Elsewhere, we see Irene and Loris chilling in his truck after being intimate. She tells him about her conversation with Michael, and how he was looking out the window at Loris's truck. This worries him greatly as he fears he'll get fired, so he strictly asks her to keep their relationship private. The next day at work, Irene is suddenly confronted by a pregnant woman, who starts yelling at her for allegedly sleeping with her husband, Loris. Caught off guard, Irene fires back, saying that Loris has already been with half the factory, and points to Agata as an example. Agata then follows her inside, and begins yelling and insulting her. The two get into an intense argument, that quickly escalates into a full-blown physical fight. Thankfully, Michael arrives to intervene, and forcibly carries Irene away from there. He yells that she could have seriously hurt Agata, but Irene doesn't respond to anything. Afterward, Irene is convinced she's now fired, and begins packing her belongings, but Milana shocks her by revealing that Michael has decided not to let her go. He has instead moved Agata to another department, leaving Irene stunned and confused. That evening, Irene is heading home on her bicycle when we see Michael following her in his car, but he soon loses sight of her. Then, out of nowhere, Irene enters his car and demands to know why he's been following her. She suspects that he has bad intentions and begins to undress in exchange for not firing her. But Michael says he doesn't want that, and just wanted to make sure nothing bad happens to her. This confuses Irene, but she simply says she's starving and suggests going somewhere to eat. They soon arrive at a diner, where Irene asks why he has a chauffeur and doesn't drive himself. Michael doesn't say anything further, except that he doesn't like to drive. He then asks her why she stopped swimming, but Irene remains silent. Here Michael admits that he worked in his father's factory because he didn't know what else to do with his life. Irene, however, has a passion and should consider herself lucky. But this only upsets the girl, and she angrily states that he doesn't know anything about her life. The next day, Michael approaches Irene again, claiming he wants to show her something. He takes her to an old house by the sea, and reveals his plan to open a restaurant there. Michael admits that he lied to her before, and he does have a passion. The two then stare at the sea, and spot a couple in the distance, after which Irene begins sketching the man. Here Michael asks if she can draw, and she suddenly explains she's trying to remember the face of the man who ran over her dad 10 years ago. She thinks he must have moved on with his life, gotten married, and had children. But Michael suggests it might be the opposite, and his life could just be a living hell. Days later, after work, Irene catches up to Michael's car, and tries to strike up a conversation. She asks why he hasn't been following her recently, and if he wants to hang out. But he unexpectedly responds that he's busy and drives off, leaving Irene hurt and rejected. The next day, as Irene is swimming in the local pool, the coach praises her, saying none of her girls are as fast as she is. She then notices Michael, who has been waiting for her for quite some time. When she asks what he's doing here, he reveals that he has brought her a small gift to apologize for his rude behavior. Irene refuses to forgive him at first, but Michael eventually manages to win her over. The two hang out for a while, having fun playing pickleball, and enjoying the moment. They also accidentally break someone's rearview mirror and dash away like kids, during which Irene sees Michael laugh for the first time. The next morning, Irene decides to accept the coach's offer to join her swimming team. She also informs Michael about this, who genuinely feels proud of her. Shortly after, he is visited by his wife, who is surprised to see him so happy. And so, when Michael leaves the office, a suspicious Laura begins rummaging through his files. She eventually comes across Irene's profile, and as she reads it, she is visibly shaken for some reason. That evening, when Michael returns home, Laura greets him with big news, revealing that she's pregnant. But Michael doesn't seem too happy, but gives her a hug. However, Laura soon reveals that it was a lie, and she just wanted to check if he still cared about her at all. She then starts yelling at him for getting close to Irene, who is that man's daughter. Michael calmly explains that Irene's life is a mess, and he only wants to help her. But Laura refuses to believe it, as she understands he's in love with her. In the end, she gives him an ultimatum, and orders him to let go of Irene for the betterment of all of them. Days later, we see Irene competing fiercely in a swimming competition, which she ends up winning. She's cheered by her teammates and coach, but her eyes scan the crowd, desperately searching for Michael. She notices his driver instead, who quickly signals that Michael is waiting just outside. When Irene finally finds him, they stare at each other with undeniable affection, both realizing they've deeply fallen in love. That evening, Michael, Irene, and the driver celebrate her hard-earned victory with drinks. The driver soon admits that he's too drunk and decides to take the night off, leaving Michael and Irene alone together. Afterward, Irene asks for a ride home, and Michael has no choice but to drive the car. On the way, she tries to get close to him, and he initially scolds her for her actions. But he soon gives in to her desires, but suddenly stops himself and exits the car. He keeps apologizing for something, but Irene can't understand what he's sorry for. Michael then suddenly jumps back into the car with fury and begins driving. Through a flashback to many years ago, we see a young Michael asking Laura to get in the car. Even though she insisted that she wanted to drive, Michael refused and started driving himself at full speed while drunk. A worried Laura urged him to slow down, but he ignored her completely. In the present, Michael drives at full speed again, causing Irene to become worried and beg him to slow down, but to no avail. The scene parallels 10 years ago, when a young Michael was driving recklessly near the woods. And then this happens. Here, we learn that it was he who accidentally hit and murdered Irene's father. When Irene began calling out her father, Michael panicked and dashed inside the car. The little girl soon arrived, and Michael looked at her with overwhelming guilt, before finally speeding away. In the present, Michael brings Irene to the same tragic place where her dad lost his life many years ago. Irene doesn't understand why he brought her there, and asks how he knows about this place. When Michael doesn't answer, she understands everything in that moment. As Michael reveals how he'd thought about her every single day since the accident, Irene pushes him to the ground before grabbing a rock. She is ready to smash his head to get her revenge, and Michael does not resist because he knows she deserves it, but she instead smashes his car's window and walks away from the scene. After walking all night, Irene arrives at the hospital in the morning and finds her mother, who works there as a nurse, and collapses into her mother's arms, apologizing for her behavior over the years. Mom shockingly reveals that Michael turned himself in this morning, But Irene is left conflicted, unsure whether to feel relief or sorrow. The scene then cuts to 5 years later, where we see Irene doing well in life, and now working as a swimming coach. She goes to hang out with her stepsister Pam, and it's clear that they've built a strong relationship. Then, while the two are walking down the road, Irene suddenly comes across a newly opened restaurant that sends a shiver down her spine. That's because it bears the same name that she once jokingly suggested to Michael for his restaurant. In the final scene, we see Michael immersed in renovating his restaurant when he hears some footsteps in the distance. And then suddenly, he is stunned to find Irene standing in front of him. Michael seems happy, and tears well up in his eyes upon seeing her after so many years. The movie ends with Irene giving him a gentle smile, implying that